Today we are going to be looking at Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice that Abraham did of Isaac on the altar. This is the lesson that the children looked at this morning in the Sunday school. And we're going to be looking at a version of that today. We're going to be looking at it from the book of James. We'll start in the book of James, chapter 2, and verse 21. So this is an interesting thing. Again, like we looked at with Noah and the flood, this is one of the accounts in the Bible that the historicity of it is challenged, not by skeptics who just basically don't believe any of the Bible, but actually there are a number of Bible-believing, if you will, Christians who don't believe that this story is accurately recorded in the Bible. They find a great deal of moral dilemma with this, which I think you should be able to appreciate, and we're going to look at some of that today. And so their response or their way of clarifying or of getting rid of that moral dilemma is simply to say that that portion was added in by scribes, that isn't what happened, that none of this took place. The difficulty with this is that much like many of the places in the Bible, that when you try to fix something, you break something else, right? This is what the Jehovah's Witnesses found when they set out to make their Bible, and they tried to fix all these places in the Bible, these little pesky verses that seem to indicate that Jesus is God. And so they set out to fix those little verses. The problem is when you fix this one, you break another one, right? That's a problem when you're dealing with a perfect sphere, right? You try to fix something and you mess something else up. And so that's the deal with this. So we could go and we could say, okay, Genesis 22, where it gives us this account, that's not actually accurate. The scribe messed up. The problem is that that's not the only place that mentions this story. Right? Other authors of the Bible recount this as fact and as historical fact. James is one of them. In fact, he bases his substantial contribution to Christian thought having to do with the interaction between faith and works on this account, which is very interesting. However, let's just look at that. So it says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son upon the altar?" Now, we're not going to get into this today, but you do, if you've read the Bible any substantial amount, you obviously will notice that there seems to be a bit of a contradiction between what James is saying and what Paul said on essentially the same point in Romans, where he said that Abraham was not justified by works, but by faith. And here it appears that James is saying something different, which is very interesting, and you should look into that and you should study that. It makes a very interesting study as to why these two men, who were friends and were co-laborers to a degree, would have very different views on, or what appears to be very different views on this subject. But we're not going to get into that. So this is what James says. "Seest thou how faith wrought with his works? And by works was faith made perfect?" So how was this happen? He says, "And the scripture was fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." So this is what happens, he says. He says Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac on the altar, and that was his justification by works. Now we know that Abraham was justified by faith long before this happened. And this is crucial to understanding the book of James and understanding this story out of Genesis dealing with Abraham and Isaac. That Abraham's justification was not because of what he did with Isaac. Abraham was already counted righteous by faith long before Isaac was ever born. But sacrificing Isaac on the altar the way he did achieved a certain objective that was not achieved when he believed God and was counted unto him for righteousness. And that's what James is dealing with. And that is the objective of being seen as righteous, seen having faith before people. So when Abraham believed God and it was counted for him for righteousness, nobody saw that but God. Only God could see that faith. And then Abraham went about his way, went about his life, and it wasn't exactly evident that he was actually a man of faith. And there's a great number of times in Abraham's life where it doesn't look like that was a man of faith. When he doubted and said his wife was his sister because he was afraid they'd kill him and take her. Right? That didn't seem like great faith. You'd think a man of tremendous faith would have said, well, come what may, I am going to say what's true. You'd think that's the way a man of faith would act. And yet we find that that case, and in other cases, Abraham did not always act as a man of faith. And if our story stopped right before Genesis 22, we'd always have these doubts how he could be the father of faith. But then we have this story where God tells Abraham in Genesis, I want you to take your son, your only son, only begotten son, I want you to take him up to a mountain I'm going to tell you, and I want you to put him on an altar, and I want you to sacrifice him. And it says that Abraham got up early in the morning and went and did this. And when we look at this story, we say Abraham had faith. Now, Abraham had faith years before this happened. This was the result of Abraham's faith. But us as the human observer, from our standpoint or our perspective, we look at Abraham and say, there is the moment of his faith. Now, God looked at Abraham and said, you have faith long before. And so, I do not believe that God was trying to find out if Abraham had faith. God had already counted him righteous and already named him the father of faith. What God was doing was giving Abraham an opportunity to prove to you and to I why he had reached that title. Now, what Abraham did achieve through this sacrifice was not faith, and it was not justification by faith. What Abraham achieved by doing this thing that God asked him was he became to be called the friend of God, which is a very interesting thing, and it's kind of what I want to look at. But before we get to that, there's a couple of points on this story that I think we ought to consider that are very important. One is that God spoke unto the fathers. So there is, just as there are Christians who have doubts as to the veracity of this story, there are unbelievers, most unbelievers will use this story as evidence that you cannot trust the Bible. Because they say the God of the Bible has demanded from somebody a very immoral action. And that the Christians will believe that God spoke to Abraham. And of course they mock this. I think the idea that God speaking to Abraham and to others in history is just simply silliness. And they say, well, God hasn't spoken to you. But the Bible addresses this, and I think we ought to look at it. So in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, it says, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. So here God says, or here Paul says, that God did speak to people. Now we tend to wonder how that might be. Maybe they just heard voices. This is what the people who will criticize the Bible and say you can't trust the Bible are saying, well, you got all these crazy people wandering around the desert and they're all hearing voices about God. No, that's not actually accurate. None of them, not all of them were hearing voices. Aaron never heard the voice of God. No one else did. Moses was the one God spoke to. And Moses spoke to Aaron, and Aaron spoke to Pharaoh. That's how the process worked. And most people in history have never spoken to God. This is why we need to be a bit skeptical when people today say that God has spoken to them. Especially, I'm not talking about the crackpots. I mean, we should always be skeptical of the crackpots, right? But I'm talking about Christians. I've heard too many Christians tell me, well, God spoke to me, and he said whatever. God told me this. Well, I have serious doubts that God has told you anything. In fact, I don't believe that God has spoken to any of you, and he certainly has not spoken to me. And if you're waiting in your life for God to speak to you so that it can be real, and you say, well, if God will speak to me, I will believe, God is not going to speak to you. He will not speak to you. Throughout history, God has spoken to maybe 100 people in human history. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but we are talking about an extremely small amount of people by any measure, especially proportionally. So how do we know that God spoke to anyone at all? If he's spoken to that few people and he's never going to speak to you, then how can we know if God has ever spoken to anyone? How do we know that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush? How do we know that God spoke to Abraham when he said, take your son and take him up on a mountain and sacrifice him? How do we know that that was God telling him that and not some schizophrenic delusion in his own mind? Because we have people all around our society today that say they hear voices too, telling them to do terrible and awful things. So how can we know that God has spoken to anybody? How do we know that God spoke to Abraham? Well, I think there's several key components of this to look at. One is prophetic fulfillment. Now, God makes it very clear that if anybody gets up and says that God has spoken to them and they say anything that doesn't come to pass, they are to be stoned as a false prophet. So there is zero tolerance to be wrong if God is speaking to you. Throughout my Christian experience, from the time I'm very young, I've heard many Christians basically say that God told them to do something, and I have observed with a lot of interest and realized that many of the things that God told them to do did not work out the way they said it was. I can remember people essentially saying that God told them when the rapture was going to be. And they were distinctively wrong. So you ought to be very cautious with these type of people that are saying, God talked to me, God spoke to me, and God gave me some vision of what's going to happen in the future. I know that so-and-so will be healed. I know that so-and-so is going to get a job. You're going to start a church. I've had people tell me, I have spoken to God, and God told me you are going to win 100 souls this year. Well, if that person was in San Antonio, we would be taking him out and stoning him right now. When God spoke to the prophets in the Bible and they said, this is what will come to pass, that came to pass. Not something similar to that, not something close to that, not something resembling that, but that. And the prophecies in the Bible are extremely detailed. Extremely detailed. These aren't like the prophecies of today. I prophesy that the weather will change tomorrow. Well, the weather changes every day. That's why we call it weather. I prophesy that you have heartache coming in your life. That's not a hard thing to prophesy. You all have heartache coming in your life. It may not be tomorrow. It may not be the next day. They say, somebody you know has had cancer. That's not hard. Everybody has somebody they know who has had cancer. But when we look at the prophecies that God gave the prophets, when He spoke to them, and He actually physically spoke to them, they are incredibly detailed and 100% accurate. Another thing that we can look at to know whether or not God spoke to people is the continuity and consistency of what He had to say. You say, well, not everybody, but many people hear voices and they say it's God speaking to them. Yes, but there's no continuity and there's no consistency between those voices. You have some people saying that God told them to strap a bomb vest to themselves and go blow up a market. And you have other people saying, well, God told me that I should give away everything I have and I should go help the poor. Well, there is no consistency between these two voices of God. But when we look at what God said to the prophets, we find incredible continuity and consistency. And when God told Moses to do something like raise a brazen serpent, Jesus later said that that was a symbol or that was a sign or a model of what He was going to do when He was raised up on the cross. And we find this consistency throughout the Bible. It's an incredible amount of consistency. The Bible is the most critically examined book in history. We're not talking about some recent book, some out-of-the-way text, some arcane text that nobody's really read, nobody really knows what it says, and somebody's saying it's accurate and it's the voice of God. We're talking about the book that has been printed more than probably most all other books combined. The most read book in all of history and the most critically examined book in all of history. And with all that examination, all that criticism leveled at it, they are so lame in trying to point out a problem. I've read their books on them. I have books and books of them in my library pointing out supposed contradictions in the Bible. And you know what they're down to trying to criticize? How many horses does Solomon really have in that stable? Because in one book it says it was this many, and the other book it says it was that many. So obviously the Bible is all wrong because they can't count horses. As if, stables are static things that horses never leave or come, right? It's like, ask a parent like the Kennels how many kids they have. They'll probably, depends on the day. Albert's happy. He's like, yeah, criticize the Kennels. Another thing that is evidence of the Scriptures is the miracles and signs of that God spoke to somebody. How do we know that God spoke to Moses? That was Pharaoh's question. Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, God said, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, how can I possibly know that that's God saying that? Well, look at this. And he throws his staff out and it turns into a snake. Look at this. He sends his staff over the river and it turns into blood. Look at this. He calls down the flies. He calls down the frogs. He kills the firstborn. God said this. This isn't just me saying. Look what they said about Jesus. This is Nicodemus. He says, the same came to Jesus by night and said unto him, Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher come from God. For no man can do these miracles that thou doest, except God be with him. He says, we know that God's speaking through you because of the signs and the miracles that you do. Paul also said this about the apostles. He said that God bore witness with the apostles, both with signs and wonders and diverse miracles and gifts of the Holy Ghost according to his own will. Nowadays, people are trying to believe that you can continue the miracles. They say, why don't we have healing today? If God could heal through Paul, why can't he heal through me? Because you don't understand what the healing and then was for. God actually wasn't too concerned about your illness or disease. Because every miracle they performed was very temporary. Even when they raised the dead, it was temporary. I'm not sure what my opinion would have been if I would have been Lazarus. It probably would have been what I thought about my wife, right? He raises them from the dead, and you're thinking, well, that's wonderful. But then you're thinking, now I got to go through that all over again. I got to get sick, and I got to be coughing, and everyone's standing around me mourning for me, which is the worst thing about being in the hospital. That's why I never tell anybody if I'm in the hospital. I hate the sympathy look. And so, there he is. You're thinking, well, why would I want to go through that all over again? It was over. And now I got to start over again. Every miracle that they did was temporary, so why do it? If it's not really a solution, then what's the point? The point was not the actual healing of anybody. The point was the demonstration that God had spoken to them. How do we know that God spoke to Jesus? Because that's what it says in Hebrews chapter 1. It says that God spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, but he hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. How do we know that he spoke to Jesus Christ? Because of the miracles and the signs that he performed. How do we know that God spoke to Paul? Because of the miracles and signs he performed. And so why can't you do miracles? Because God isn't speaking to you. How do I know that God isn't speaking to you? Besides the fact that you can't even heal a tummy ache. Because it says he hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. That's how God is now speaking. He is not speaking through anybody else anymore. He's only speaking through his Son. And so that's an important thing to understand when we say, well, Abraham took his son up on the mountain because God told him to do this. And if it hadn't been God saying to do it, we would look at that and say, that's a terrible thing. But because God said to do it, then we accept it. But how do we know that God spoke to Abraham? Well, we know it by the reasons that we've stated. So, now let's look at the issue of the human sacrifice, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the appallingness of this story. When people look at the Bible and they're appalled at it, this is one of the principal portions that they're appalled with. The idea that God would in any way countenance human sacrifice, which is essentially what it says. And let's look at the verse real quick. 2 of the verses in Genesis 22. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And I want you to notice something here of how Abraham perceived this whole turn of events. In Abraham's mind, there was no human sacrifice was going to happen. There is not a single thing said in this passage that would indicate that Abraham intended or that viewed that his son was actually going to be put to death, which is very critical to understand. When Abraham got and he saw the mountain he needed to be on from far away, he told the servants that was traveling with him, You're going to stay here, we're going to go up, and then me and the boy will return. That was what Abraham's expectation was. Abraham's expectation was not that he was going to kill his son. And when Isaac looked around and said, There's something missing here. We got firewood and we got fire. Where's the sacrifice? Abraham didn't go, Well, I hadn't mentioned it yet, but no, not at all. He said, God will provide himself a lamb. And that was his full expectation. Why and then would God ask him to do this? If God had no intention of him sacrificing his son, except in a figure, and Abraham had no expectation that God was going to actually demand this, then why the charade, if you want to call it this? Because God wanted you and I to know that Abraham was a man of faith. Now, what was Abraham's faith? I believe that Abraham's faith was as much willingness to take his son up there as it was the knowledge that God had other plans. And I think that when we look at that combination, Abraham's willingness and readiness, because it said he got up early in the morning to do what God asked. He didn't dilly-dally. He didn't wait and say, well, let's wait till the end of the day. We'll go at the last possible moment and see if God changes his mind. But rather, his faith told him, act promptly and with the expectation that God will act according to his character, which is what we see happened. And this is also seconded by Paul in Hebrews 11. He says, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that received the promises offered up his only begotten son. Now, what God asked him to do was offer him up. And that's what Paul says Abraham did. He gave his son to God. But this is Abraham's state of mind, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence he also received him in a figure. I believe that Abraham's faith informed his decisions, informed his actions to such a degree that Abraham understood what was going on, that he was in a figure offering his son up. We do this similar thing even today in some churches. They'll do some form of a confirmation, and they'll bring a little baby that's born, and they'll give them to the pastor or to the priest or to whoever it is, the religious leader, and they'll take the child in a form they are giving that child to God. Now, they are not actually saying he's yours and now hit the door, although sometimes you might wish you had have done that, right? But that's not what they're doing. They're not actually really saying he belongs to the church or he belongs to God or that's not really what they're doing. What they're doing is it's a figure saying, in our heart, we are acknowledging he is God's. And this is what Abraham was doing. But let's talk about a little bit about human sacrifice, because there's a reason why this is viewed wrongly, I believe. And that's because every civilization has been founded on human sacrifice, no matter where you look. And I'm talking about real human sacrifice. Now, one of the most infamous ones, obviously, is the Aztec culture, which reached a degree right before the Spaniards arrived to the New World that they were sacrificing 250,000 people a year. One reason they didn't have enough soldiers to fight off the Spaniards is because they had killed them all. They had a game that they would do where they would take a particular person, they'd grab a man out of the population, and they'd give him a toy weapon, a little stick. And then if he could win the contest against the soldier, then he got to live. And usually they died because the soldiers were like outfitted as soldiers with real weapons, and he had this stick, and it's one against like 4 or 5. So generally he would lose. But there was one they tell of in their history that won. He just decimated all of them. And then they carried him around, and they said they were going to make him a god, and he says no, that what he really wanted to do was die an honorable death as a human sacrifice. So their culture was quite corrupt in this way. And here's what we find in most cultures. In fact, the vestiges of human sacrifice are everywhere. I don't know if you know what this is. Ari? This is pozole. It is a Mexican soup. Delicious Mexican soup, and Ari makes it very good. And if you're in the crowd, you get invited to eat pozole. I feel like an Aztec warrior when I'm there. Pozole was the stew that they served the emperor. I don't know if you knew this, Adi, but it was the soup served to the emperor made from the thigh muscles of the human sacrifices. And you thought menudo was gross. When the Spaniards arrived to the New World and found all of this happening, they forbade it. And so they substituted it with pork, and the Aztecs said it made no difference, it tastes the same. So that should tell you what you're made out of. But I want to tell you that moral society requires voluntary human sacrifice. You cannot have a moral society without human sacrifice. Now, it needs to be voluntary. There are too many things in our world that require tremendous hardship, tremendous sacrifice. And who's going to do it? There are jobs to do that are very dangerous. Somebody's got to put themselves at risk. Some of you might talk of the pay scale gap, but do you know that men bear 90% of job place deaths? 90% of the deaths in job sites are from men. There's a lot of dangerous jobs to do. There's some nasty jobs to do. There's some jobs to do that you and I probably would rather not do, right? I mean, I've seen something like this. That's a form of human sacrifice right there. You wonder why it is your plumbing works? Because there's people willing to do things like this. There's people willing to do things like this. I'm not sure why they're doing that. Those women definitely deserve equal pay. There's people willing to do these kind of things, dangerous and dirty jobs. People willing to do this. That's human sacrifice. That's about as close to a human burnt offering as you can get. Now, nobody's forcing this person to do this, and I hope they're compensated well. There's people willing to do this, to sacrifice themselves for you. That's actually in San Antonio just recently. There's people willing to do this for you. Self-sacrifice is the bedrock of civilization. Involuntary human sacrifice is immoral, but there can be no moral civilization unless people are willing to sacrifice themselves, unless parents are willing to give their lives for their children, unless husbands are willing to give their life for their wives, unless citizens are willing to give their life for random people they don't know. We cannot have civilization. Let's look at the true nature of friendship now. Because this is what the Bible says was the conclusion of what Abraham did. Abraham took his son up on the altar, offered him up to God in a figure, it says. He didn't actually kill him. I don't believe he ever had any expectation whatsoever of doing it. I believe Abraham stated his faith quite clearly. God was going to provide a lamb. And that's exactly what God did. Abraham never had a doubt, and God never had a different plan than what exactly happened there. And because of all that, it says he became God's friend. Now that's a pretty interesting statement. Being the friend of God. You know, you and I mostly define ourselves many times by our friendships. If you're friends with somebody who people think is important, well, that makes you very happy. If you were friends with the mayor, you would feel pretty good about yourself. You'd probably get a bumper sticker that said, "I'm friends with the mayor." I mean, it's not catchy, but what else do you need, right? You don't need wit when you're the friend of the mayor. Well, Abraham became God's friend. Now that sounds pretty good to me. But when we look at what Abraham did and we look at what happened with his son, we see that there's a certain nature about friendship that maybe we should consider. For instance, that friendship requires trust. You think, man, I want to be God's friend. Well, are you willing to do what Abraham did? If God told you, I want you to take this thing that you love, I want you to take something that for you is irreplaceable, and I want you to take it out tomorrow, and I want you to shoot it behind the barn. Would you get up early in the morning and set out to do what God had told you to do? You're thinking, I'm glad God doesn't speak to me. And no kidding. But it was that trust that Abraham had. This wasn't Abraham saying, well, I'm a slave and God's the master and whatever He tells me to do, I just have to do. That was not the relationship that James describes. He says the relationship between Abraham and God in that moment of sacrificing Isaac was not a servant obeying a master. It was the trust of a friend. God is my friend, Abraham is saying, and I can trust Him. And so when Isaac says, where's the lamb? Where's the sacrifice? Abraham says, without a hesitation and without one shred of doubt, God will provide a lamb because we're friends. But if you don't trust God implicitly, then how can you think that you could be friends? If you're not willing to trust Him, then you cannot be friends. We confuse acquaintances with friends. And some people aren't even acquaintances of God. But if you want to be God's friend and you want Him to be your friend, you're going to have to trust Him. And you say, well, that's hard. It is hard. It is very hard. I imagine it was pretty hard. That looks hard to me. That looks really hard because I don't trust people very easily. That's why I hate it when people are behind me. I'm always looking, that's why when we have open meetings, I don't like them because they're circles. You got people behind you, don't know what they're plotting on you, right? Don't like it. So yeah, trust is an issue. But you can't be friends if you can't trust each other. But friendship not only requires trust, it requires action. Abraham had to get up. A lot of people talk about how they trust God. I trust God. They're like Abraham, right? Only they're not. They have what God has asked them to give up, and they're saying, do you trust me? And they say, absolutely. Then let go. No. There are some Stephen and Audie just went to Niagara Falls. We've been there and read up quite a bit on this. And there used to be a guy, there was a guy once that stretched up a rope across it or a cable, and he did a show, and he got up on the cable and he walked across and came back. And was, whoa! He says, now watch this. He gets a wheelbarrow, wheels it across, and he comes back. Everyone's clapping. Watch this, he takes and he puts 200 pounds of cement in the wheelbarrow, and walks across, and comes back. Whoa! How many people think I could do it with a person? Everyone raises their hands. No, who wants to go? That's how we are with God. Oh, God can do anything. Do you trust me to do anything with your life? Do it with Adrian's life. He'll do it. Remember one time I heard of probably didn't happen, but I heard this story of a guy who he's walking along in the forest or kind of in a rugged wilderness, and all of a sudden he didn't realize it's so black, and he falls over a cliff, and he falls and he grabs and he's hanging on to some vegetation, and he's holding on, and he gets himself wrapped in there, and he's yelling, "Help! Help!" And then he hears a voice from the edge saying, "I'm here, I'll help you." "Great, help me." And the voice says, "Let go." Is there anyone else? You can't trust God if you're not willing to put that trust in effect, in action. That's what James is saying. Abraham had faith, but faith that never does anything isn't faith. It's pretense. How do we know that Abraham had faith? Because his works perfected his faith. He didn't have works that produced faith. He had faith that produced works. Because works never produce faith. But faith, according to James, always produces works. And so if you're going to say, "I trust God," you have to act upon that trust. You're going to have to do some things that are hard to do. Now, I'm not saying that God is telling you to take your son up on Mount Moriah and tie him up on an altar. That is not what God has told us to do. We know what God has told us to do. It's in the Bible. So God has told you to love your wife. God has told you to love your children. God has told you to love your neighbor. And then He's explained what love means. And love isn't feeling, it's action. So start there. You say, "I trust God." Do you? Do you trust Him to act out love to the person you least like? Which is a story that you're studying in the youth group, the Good Samaritan. Who is your neighbor whom you should love? The person you least like. So those of you young people in school today, find the one person in your school that you least like. Do you trust God? Then act out that faith. Those of you that have jobs, find the one co-employee that most rubs you the wrong way. Do you love God? Are you willing to give something up? Are you willing to sacrifice yourself? Are you willing to do voluntary self-sacrifice? To put in effect, to put into action your faith? That's what friendship is. I'm not talking about friendship with the world. I'm talking about you being a friend of God. Because friendship requires sacrifice. You can't be a friend and not lose something. It costs something to be someone's friend. We have a great example in the Bible of friendship. David and Jonathan. Jonathan was David's friend. And when Jonathan realized that David was going to take the throne, which meant what? That he wouldn't get the throne, A, and B, in order for that to happen, he was going to have to die prematurely. Jonathan wasn't stupid. He knew what it meant. It meant him and his family was going to die. And he took off his robes and took off his weapons and he gave them to David. Because David was his friend. If you're not willing to sacrifice anything, then how can you be a friend? If it's all about you and what you can get, then you're no kind of friend at all, are you? Well, God wants you to be His friend. Just like He wanted Abraham to be His friend. But you can't be God's friend if you're not willing to lose something. There's a cost involved. Now, the Bible gave us the ultimate measure of friendship. Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Jesus wants to be your friend. And He proved it. He paid the ultimate price to be your friend. And why does it say? Of course, they were saying it in a pejorative way. The friend of sinners He's called. But that's exactly what He is. He is the friend of sinners. They meant it as some type of a criticism, mocking Him. They didn't want to be friend of sinners. And because of that, they weren't even friends of God. But Jesus was the friend of God and the friend of sinners. It's an amazing thing. Is Jesus Christ your friend? He paid the ultimate price to be your friend. What have you paid to be His friend? Are you willing to give up the things that displease Him? Are you willing to put aside the things that are stopping you from trusting God implicitly? If you're not, then don't be surprised that you're not God's friend. And what does Jesus say is going to happen to that class of people? They're going to get to heaven and He's going to say, in judgment, "I never knew you. I don't know who you are. You're not my friends." They say, "Lord, Lord, we prophesied in your name." And He says, "I don't know who you are. You're unknown to me. You are not my friend." My friends trust me. My friends act out that faith by their works. My friends sacrifice themselves for others. That's our bond of friendship. That's what Jesus told the apostles. They were all debating over who got to be number one. And Jesus says, "I'm your Lord, and I washed your feet." If you want to be like me, you have to be like me in these ways. He says, "I'm your Lord, and I sacrificed for people that hated me." What have you given up for anybody else? Abraham did an amazing thing. He took his faith, he put it into action promptly in the morning with full expectation of God, acting out his best nature, and became the friend of God. You can be God's friend also.